Testing, testing. Testing, testing.
You might also need to put it on mute, by the way, to make sure we're not getting extraneous noises during the first part of my presentation.
Everyone
Yes,
on mute.
yes. Let's put everyone.
Thomas, you are on. Thomas,
You're on mute.
Thomas.
Yeah, I mute myself. Okay. I'm just going to remind everyone that there will be a Q&A at the end. So you will be, the best thing to do is probably raise your hand and the host will unmute you. So Keith, having said that, welcome for another year. I was just sort of ruminating today thinking in prior years, there's always been a sort of a predictable focus of what your concerns and addresses for the year are, but it seems like this year, I don't even know where to begin. So I'm going to turn it over to you to help us try to sort through what seems to be a big jigsaw puzzle right now.
Well, thank you very much indeed, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be back with you. As I point out each year, I've been giving talks to this Rotary Club now for almost half a century. So I go back to the days of old Max Cornelius, who was an avid member of King's Cross Rotary, and then his widow, Dr. Stella Cornelius. So it's a pleasure to be back with you. What I thought I would do this evening is to look at three issues, which seem to be fairly top of mind. One is Ukraine, and Ray has already indicated that we need to look at Ukraine. The second one is the situation in the United Kingdom, particularly the scandal over the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. And then thirdly, to give a bit of an update about the United States, and particularly as we've just come up to the first anniversary of Biden's time in the White House. He's been in power now for 1 year. So starting off with Ukraine, trying to make sense of Ukraine. As you know, the immediate sparking point has been the deployment of 120,000 troops by Russia right on the Russian side of the Ukrainian border. This is a very deep-seated issue. Now, President Putin would say Ukrainians and Russians are basically the same kith and kin, and Ukraine belongs in Russia. And of course, for quite some time, Ukraine was part of the old Soviet empire. In 1991, that empire collapsed. We get the end of the Cold War, which at a time of all the bad news that we're thinking about at the moment, that was a really significant development and a good, I think, a good progressive development. Putin said it was the biggest tragedy to hit the 20th century. I think it was one of the biggest successes because we avoided a head-on World War III between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, in the breakup of the Soviet Empire, it was agreed that Russia, the Soviet Union, would withdraw its forces from East Germany. Now, under the post-World War II agreement, the British, French, and Americans had the right to occupy forces in West Germany, and the Russians retained forces in East Germany. So you had West Germany with Britain, France, and the United States, and then East Germany controlled by the Soviet Union. And of course, with the onset of the Cold War, we got the formation of NATO. NATO has had three basic tasks. One was to keep the Russians out. Second is to keep the Americans in. And the third one is to keep the Germans down. In other words, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was designed to prevent the Soviet Union, with a huge standing army left in 1945, to prevent that from moving west into Western Europe. It was also designed to keep the Americans engaged in world affairs. It's hard to imagine, but the big fear that people like Winston Churchill had was that at the end of World War II, the Americans would behave as they did at the end of World War I, namely fall back into an isolationist mindset. Luckily, when President Eisenhower became the first post-war Republican president, he kept the Republican Party engaged in international affairs. We saw under Donald Trump a movement away from that towards becoming more isolationist, but it was Eisenhower, who was president for 8 years, who committed the Republican Party to being equally active in international affairs as the Democratic Party had been. So keep the Russians out, keep the Americans in, and keep the Germans down. Again, it's hard to imagine now, but the great fear in 1945 was that the Germans might try a third attempt at trying to conquer Europe. And so the Russians did us a favor by occupying East Germany and keeping an eye on the East Germans. And the British, the French, the Americans did the Russians a favor by keeping an eye on West Germans. So in 1991, we had the situation whereby the Soviet Union clearly was in an anomalous situation. It was still occupying East Germany, which was legal. That's part of the old post-World War II treaty. But Gorbachev said, look, he'd be willing to withdraw from East Germany and then to facilitate the reunification of the two Germanies without any Soviet military presence or Russian military presence. But the quid pro quo was that NATO must agree not to move east. That, unfortunately, that was not written down, but we do now have documents which record that conversation. They've now been released by the US National Archives. So that was the arrangement, and it was honored by George Bush Sr. But then President Clinton, a great leader of men and a great follower of women, came to power, and then he started to move that NATO eastern frontier further and further east and started to recruit former Soviet territories. So we come to the current crisis where Putin has got, I think, a number of motivations. One is that he really does believe that Ukraine should be part of Russia. And there are Russians in eastern Ukraine who really want to be part of Russia because they're worried that the western end of Ukraine, we're talking about one of the largest countries in Europe, by the way, in geographical spread. So it's a huge country, and the western end of it is more pro-European and the eastern end is more pro-Russian. And Putin, I think, is trying to recruit the Russian-speaking part of Ukraine. And at the moment, of course, the Russians have assisted the nationalists in eastern Ukraine in proclaiming these new territories independent of Kiev, the national capital. Not that they're getting much recognition, but they have proclaimed separate areas. I think also Putin thought that the United States was on the run. It clearly has been defeated in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's bogged down in an inconclusive struggle in Syria against the so-called Islamic State. And so Putin figured, look, America is in disarray internationally. It's in disarray domestically because of the very toxic culture wars that are going on, all this political correctness stuff and all the rest of it. This will be a good time to maneuver forces onto the border. Now, there are 120,000 troops, give or take a few, that are on the border. That's not enough to get to Kiev. It'll be enough to perhaps solidify Russian control over the eastern end of Ukraine, the pro-Russian end. But you cannot get to Kiev. It's a long distance. You can't get to Kiev with just 120,000 troops and so many Ukrainians who have now been well armed by Western countries. So I don't really think that Putin would be that stupid to invade with an attempt to take over Kiev. Mind you, just because something is stupid, it doesn't mean the politicians won't do it. But it doesn't seem to make, for me, much sense. Putin's problem is that he's put himself into a corner. He's got the 120,000 troops on the border. The Americans, who are squabbling so much between themselves, have all suddenly come together and are supporting a very hard line against Russia. He has miscalculated the mood within the United States. And so we just don't know how this is going to progress. Now, I might just go off at a slight tangent and talk about ways of thinking about the future. So there are basically three ways of thinking about the future. One is prediction. And so I'm called upon to do predictions, particularly this time of the year, about how things are going to go. When does COVID disappear, etc. Most predictions are a waste of time. But one which is transforming our lives is what's called Moore's Law, which is the doubling power of computers. And that progress is being made, or the change, I'm not sure it's progress, but that change is being maintained. So the real question will be, I guess, around the year 2050, what is the future of humans? Because by that time, computers will be more powerful than humans. Will they perhaps keep us on as pets? Or will they decide, look, there's no good use for humans. They're too interested in sport and Hollywood gossip. Just let them go. We don't know. But anyway, that's one way of thinking about the future. Prediction. Most predictions are a waste of time, but not relating to information technology. Second way of thinking about the future is preferred. Having a vision and then building a bridge back from the future to the present. The creation of NATO was a good example of having a vision. The architects of NATO wanted to create an international organization which will defend the West from Soviet aggression. So that was done 70 years ago, and it's remained in force and has been a great success for Western countries. So that's the role of vision. And then the third way of thinking about the future is possible, not what is being currently predicted, not what you necessarily like to see happen, but what could happen. And this is where I do my scenario planning. So let me give you two scenarios on how things might go in Ukraine. The pessimistic scenario is that, in fact, there will be a war. Maybe a political miscalculation by Putin, maybe young, headstrong soldiers initiating some sort of flash fight, which then suddenly escalates out of control. That will obviously cause a huge amount of suffering. I'm not sure it'll trigger a nuclear war, but we have no idea how it could go. It's not particularly a good scenario at all, this risk of war. The alternative scenario is the one that, in a sense, I've hinted at already, which is that the Western countries find a way of helping Putin to get out of the corner in which he has put himself. Now, I noticed that a few hours ago, Jens Stoltenberg, who's the General Secretary or Secretary General of NATO, has indicated that NATO will not be sending military forces into Ukraine. They're supplying weaponry, but not actually troops on the ground. I think that's a good development. And so we've got to find a way of enabling Putin to get out of the corner into which he has very foolishly put himself. So maybe the statement from the NATO Secretary General, no NATO troops will be deployed in Ukraine. I've noticed that Boris Johnson is anxious to have British troops there. I'll speak a little later about Boris's problems. And I think also perhaps a commitment by NATO that Ukraine will not be invited to join NATO. And I think also from a military point of view, you're pushing your border so far east that you really want to make sure that if you were to have a fight in Ukraine, that you haven't extended the border so far east that it's just going to be very difficult to operate your lines of supply and lines of communication. So they're the two scenarios. One is, perhaps even as we speak, a war gets underway. The second one is that we find ways of doing crisis management and being able to talk down the crisis, a bit of like where we were in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So they're the two scenarios on how the Ukrainian crisis could play out. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. Let me get on to my second topic, which is the United Kingdom. I haven't dealt with the UK, I don't think, in recent years. So the UK has got a most colourful individual, Boris Johnson, who is the MP for Uxbridge. So it's our family MP. My father has said don't underestimate Boris Johnson. He may look like an idiot, but he's actually quite a calculating and cool mind. I think it's interesting that Boris Johnson is someone who's spent his life plotting to become prime minister and enjoying the plotting. I'm not sure that he's actually enjoying being prime minister. I think he's found that it's a lot more complicated. And at the moment, when you've got COVID, it's almost like swimming in syrup. A lot of things you would like to do, you can't do. He certainly managed to secure Brexit, but of course, there are immense issues with bedding down Brexit. The Brexit situation is still not being completely cleared up. We still don't know for sure what's going to be happening about the arrangements on the Northern Ireland border. So we still have immense problems. We're trying to make sense of Brexit. However, the reason Boris Johnson is in strife is because of the allegations of there being parties being held at his official residence, number 10 Downing Street. In particular, we've had these appalling photos of, on the one hand, the Queen sitting alone at the funeral of her husband, the Duke of Edinburgh, contrasted with the party which took place the previous day at 10 Downing Street, where people clearly were not on their own. There was no isolation there. The Queen was following the government's rules. The government was not following the government's rules. And there is, as we speak, an investigation being carried out by the chief ethicist of the British government, Sue Gray, to find out exactly what has happened. It's interesting that Scotland Yard were asked to investigate this also in early December, and Dame Cressida said, no, this is not a matter for Scotland Yard, it's too controversial. But it's interesting that Dame Cressida, the commissioner, has been forced into carrying out an investigation. Now, remember, we're talking about a non-custodial sentence. If anybody's going to get found guilty, they'll be fined. That's all you can do. You can't put people in jail. We're talking about very low-level offences. But as they say in politics, it's the optics that count. The Queen sitting alone at the funeral, Boris Johnson and his friends socialising in the garden at number 10. And so for me, I find it fascinating that you see Britain embroiled in this struggle over Ukraine. Boris Johnson is due to be having a phone conversation with Putin in a couple of days' time. I'm not sure what he expects to achieve, except perhaps getting the parties off the front page. So we have this weird situation that we have a major crisis overseas. We still have a major domestic crisis in the United Kingdom because of COVID, and the strains have been placed on the national health system and the bad handling of the COVID crisis. In the UK, it's very interesting when you look at what's going on in other parts of the world and contrast it with what's gone on in Australia. I was recently giving a talk in the City of London because the financiers in the City of London were intrigued by having such a low level, in comparative terms, a low level of COVID deaths. How did Australia do it? And also that of New Zealand, how compared with what we've seen in the United States and the United Kingdom, as well as, of course, Russia and elsewhere. So it is really interesting that we haven't suffered from the COVID crisis in a way that you see in the UK. So we have Boris Johnson, on the one hand, embroiled with this foreign policy crisis with Ukraine, embroiled in a domestic crisis over COVID, embroiled in all the post-Brexit arrangements, labour shortages, supply shortages. Obviously, one of the byproducts of Brexit is that you don't have the cheap foreign labour coming in now from Eastern Europe. The second most common language in Britain used to be Polish, but we've lost a lot of those Polish workers because of the withdrawal from the European Union. And then at the same time, the thing that is really angering a lot of British voters is the issue of the perceived irresponsibility of the British government, the failure to follow their own rules. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out. As I say, we're waiting for Sue Gray's report, which will also feed into any charges being laid by Dame Cressida Dick and Scotland Yard. But even if people do go on trial and they're found guilty, nobody's going to go to jail. they'll simply get a fine. But it'll be bad for the Conservative government if, in fact, they're found to have broken their own regulations. One of the interesting factors for Boris Johnson to bear in mind that when he had the election a couple of years ago, he did extremely well in the north of England in breaking what's called the Red Wall. So if you look at England, the southern part of England, London and elsewhere, Uxbridge, they're all blue, they're all Conservative. Then the northern part of England, it's red, it's Labour. And then when you get into Scotland, it again becomes more Labour. But what is interesting is that under Boris Johnson, they were able to break down that red wall. And you've got a number of MPs who are now in office, who never expected to get into office. They were simply running to get their name well known to the Conservative Party. So they would then end up with being given a safe constituency. And instead they've won. It's a remarkable achievement by Boris Johnson because the Labour Party was busy self-destructing under Jeremy Corbyn, who of course has now been replaced. Indeed, at one point was expelled from the Labour Party, his own party. So we see those people are now having to do their own calculations. Remember, politicians talk in terms of national interest, but they actually only think in terms of self-interest. And they're doing their own calculations. Should I continue to support Johnson, or would a new leader like Rishi Sunak, would I do better with a new leader? Would I get a better chance of re-election in a couple of years' time? Let me just give you a little footnote with Rishi Sunak, who's the Chancellor of the Exchequer of Indian descent, and not an old Etonian, but he did go to Winchester, so he went to an elite private school, but not Eton. And of course, he did went to Oxford, and then went into finance. And it's triggered a survey of the number of, well, what would we call? We would call them lesbians, people of a non-English speaking background in this country. So we call them lesbians or Chaldeans from culturally and linguistically diverse background, a polite way of referring to people who are not solidly white Anglo-Saxon. It's very interesting. The British now have in their parliament, on a per capita basis, more of these foreigners, if you like, or non-whites, whatever you want to call them, than any other country in Western Europe. Then a remarkable change has occurred in Great Britain and shows the flexibility of the British political culture. And as I say, one of the front runners to replace Boris Johnson would be his Chancellor of the Exchequer, his Minister of Finance, who would be the first person from the Indian subcontinent elected into Downing Street. Or it may be Liz Truss, who's the current Foreign Secretary, who's recently here in Australia. She, of course, would represent another dimension in the sense that she'd be another female in number 10. So the British scene is very interesting indeed. And let me now just conclude, keeping an eye on the time. Let me now just conclude with where we're up to with the United States, which is always a fascinating talking point. So Joe Biden has come to the end of his first year in office. He's been elected for 4 years. He can run if he wants to, and if he's able to, he can run for another 4 years. So he's had his first year in office. And I think a lot of people would say that he's done a lot better than a lot of people were expecting. His image was that of Sleepy Joe, someone who's going to be making errors all the time. But in fact, he has achieved some significant pieces of legislation. He's been let down by 2 members of his own political party, Joe Manchin from West Virginia, and on the other side of the United States, Arizona, Christian Sinema, both Democrat senators, but both very critical of Biden and making Biden's life very difficult. So Biden has got another year to go in the American political cycle, in the sense that you're elected for 4 years, but generally speaking, your first 2 years are more comfortable than your last 2 years. because in the middle of the presidential term, you have what are called the midterm elections. So all the lower house is up for election every 2 years. The House of Representatives is up for election, and then 1/3 of the Senate, because senators are elected for 6 years. So it means that in the United States, you're perpetually getting ready for November elections. You've either just had them or you're looking forward to the next lot. And so the problem for Biden is that the Republican Party is making it more and more difficult for people to actually vote in the United States. So the Republican Party is basically a white party, and they're in positions of influence. They are not necessarily representative of all the Americans now that you'll see in the United States. So they have disproportionate influence in drawing up electoral boundaries. And one of the warnings I have to give Australian audiences, don't think of America in terms of how we operate here in Australia. We have a Commonwealth electoral system. We have one national electoral roll. We make it compulsory for people to register to vote, compulsory for people to go out and vote, a whole series of regulations. We are the international benchmark for elections. Now, we still put duds into our own parliament, but we do have the benchmark for the actual mechanism of election. In the United States, by contrast, the rules vary from one county to another or one state to another. It's a very chaotic situation. And so the Republicans are making the most of that chaos at the moment by redistricting, as it's called, moving people around, or the boundaries anyway, getting moved around, etc. And so the elections that will be fought in November coming up this year, so these are the midterm elections this year, may well go badly for the Democrat Party. Traditionally, they do go badly for the party in power. And so if they go badly for Biden, Biden will lose control of the lower house, which he has at the moment, and Biden might lose some control in the Senate. Remember, it's very evenly balanced in the Senate when you've got a vice president who is president pro tem of the chamber, and she is able to, for certain key matters, providing Manchin and Sinema cooperate, she can use that casting vote to push an issue over the edge and get it elected. That all may change after November of this year, in which case, in a further year's time, when I'm back with you, I might be talking about a Congress which is more hostile to Joe Biden. One of the manifestations will be a Republican-controlled lower house may well decide to impeach Joe Biden for stealing last year's election. I don't think the Democrats did, but you might find that as a campaign because Donald Trump remains very unforgiving. And on the subject of Donald Trump, just to make the comment that Donald Trump remains the most vibrant force in the Republican Party. It's an incredible achievement. His family come from New York. They are traditional donors of the Democrat Party. And I'm not sure that Trump had ever voted Republican on any in any year. And as I say, New York is liberal, it's Democratic, etc. And yet he's been able to take over the Republican Party and still remains the #1 campaigner in that party. Now, whether or not you like him, one has to recognize talent when you see it. And it's been a remarkable achievement by Donald Trump for what he's been able to do, just to be able to take over an entire political party, kick out the establishment, such as the Bush Republicans. They've all been excluded now from key positions. And so Trump has got his own people in many of those key positions. You've even got non-Trump Republicans as a category now. They have an advertising campaign called the Lincoln Project. Abraham Lincoln was a very well-known Republican president. And this is a campaigning organization very critical of Donald Trump. So it's quite a remarkable achievement on the part of Donald Trump that he's been able, as an outsider, to take over this entire party, the party of Abraham Lincoln, and been able to reshape it in his own image. As I say, he will be a forceful presence in the November midterm elections. He won't himself be running, but he will be very influential, and it may well be a good opportunity for him to knock out residues of the Republican Party that he doesn't approve of, the hangovers from the Bush era, etc. So he can get rid of those people and obviously get more hardliners elected to the lower house in order to take at least control of the lower house and perhaps even the Senate. And then Trump will run again, we think, in 3 years' time for the next presidential election. And he remains very popular. Remember, Donald Trump received more votes than any other Republican candidate in history. He made politics interesting. As someone who broadcasts on politics, I've got to say, the amount of interest that we have in US politics because of Donald Trump is quite amazing. Now, of course, Biden got more votes than Donald Trump. So we had a record number of people going out to vote in last year's election. And that's Donald Trump that's made politics interesting. For good or ill, he's made politics very interesting. So let me summarize then with where I am, so as to give plenty of time for questions and also induction of new members, etc. In the case of the Ukraine, two possible scenarios. One is that we might end up with an armed conflict, or that we can find a way of getting Putin out of the corner into which he has put himself, and perhaps to reaffirm the importance of that 1991 agreement between Mikhail Gorbachev and George Bush Sr. Number two, the question of the United Kingdom. Boris Johnson, who did brilliantly, again, I'm just simply recognizing talent when I see it, not necessarily endorsing or otherwise, or election a couple of years ago, but is now in very severe trouble. And the general feeling is that he'll be gone by the end of the year. Some people are in contact, I'm in contact with in London, are saying he'll be gone by Easter. The problem is that Rishi Sunak does not want to take over the number 10 at the moment because the country is going to be in a bit of a mess. He'd be inheriting a huge headache. But certainly, I think Johnson looks like he's on the way out. And then thirdly, we have US politics remains absolutely fascinating as always. Joe Biden has had a better year than a lot of people were predicting. And Trump remains a potent force in American politics. I'll leave it at that point, Mr. President, but I'll be open to any questions that people want to raise. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. That was a great and enlightening talk. Here's the way that I would like to handle our Q&A, recognizing that I would like to leave about 10 minutes for the induction of our new member, Sam Horton, and yet give enough time to for our members to query you, Keith. So I'm going to ask people. I will act as the moderator. If you will, I don't have a full screen. Pete, can you act as the moderator and ask people to use either their hands or the raise their hand function with Zoom, and we'll continue for about the next 13 minutes until 10 minutes before the hour. Is that all right?
Sounds good.
Okay. So the floor is now open for questions.
Ken, I believe you had a question, and then we'll go over to Bruce.
Thank you. Keith, thank you for that excellent overview. Can I just direct you to America and Russia and China, Australia and China relations? May I just ask for a few minutes on that? I think that in our area is very dangerous. Maybe Taiwan, North Korea brought into that as well.
There's so many, that's almost a separate talk in its own right. So in regards to North Korea, we've got to recognize that North Korea is now a nuclear power. Again, I'm no admirer of the Kim family, but they have achieved something quite remarkable. They've now become a nuclear power on a par with Israel and Britain and France, and India and Pakistan. So they've been able to achieve all of that while keeping us talking on one side for the last 20, almost 30 years, talking about nuclear weapons, etc. And this country, which is dirt poor, extensive malnutrition, and yet has been able to acquire nuclear weapons. So the warning really is that if North Korea can acquire nuclear weapons, anybody can do so. So North Korea is certainly a very dangerous place to watch. It's a sign of American failure in diplomacy because America took the running in opposing North Korea. It's now become a headache for China, and North Korea has made it quite clear that it's running with its own agenda. So even though China is trying to get maximum good, positive publicity for the Winter Olympics, the North Koreans are still testing weapons, whereas you would expect the North Koreans to leave things alone, get the Winter Olympics out of the way, and then we can get back to business as usual. Kim has said, no, we're going to continue testing our nuclear weapons. So we're not worried about offending China. So certainly, yes, keeping an eye on North Korea. Secondly, relations between China and the rest of the world. I think there is a cooling of the love feast that was going on between China and the rest of the world. President Clinton was anxious to get China into the World Trade Organization, the theory being that as China liberalized its economy, that you'd bring on political change and China would become fully a member of the international trading order. That has not happened. China has made the most of its time in the World Trade Organization, but has not liberalized. It's not become a freer society. There's even more persecution now in China than we've seen in recent years. So China is not becoming a liberal country. In regard to China and Australia, the warning I give, I think every time I give this talk at King's Cross, is that we have to be diversifying our range of customers. We cannot rely on China as a good trading partner. It's interesting that in recent weeks, the Chinese have got back to buying Australian coal because they excluded it at one point, the coking coal. But it's interesting they're now bringing it back in because they need it. They've got an energy crisis in China. So very slowly they've been mugged by reality. But the lesson really from this incident between China and Australia is that if you're going to be a bully, then you've got to make sure you're going to beat the other person to submission. Australia has not been beaten into submission. Australia has said, okay, we will lose our red wine exports to China. And that's caused a huge amount of suffering for people in, say, the red wine industry. I talk here as a Methodist, so it's no great worry to me that red wine producers are going bankrupt. But Australia has said, we will wear this brutality by the Chinese, and we're still left standing. And so other countries around the world have seen the way that Australia has stood up to China and has not backed down. And I think it's been an example to other countries. And the problem for China, and this is the role of the new ambassador who's just arrived in Canberra, will be how to improve relations between China and Australia, because clearly Australia is not going to get bullied. Now, there is also the flashpoint with Taiwan and China. No easy way to resolve that either. Remember, President Xi has been very different from some of his predecessors. So when Deng Xiaoping took over in 1979, he decided that China would just slowly and quietly reestablish its position in the global economy, back to where it was 500 years ago, responsible for about a third of global economic output. And he's done that, he did that very quietly. His successors have also followed that policy. President Xi is different. President Xi has an in-your-face aggressiveness, which is causing, I think, problems. He was able to exploit the Americans, who wasted 20 years of their time chasing a handful of Muslims around the world. And he used 20 years to reshape the global economy through the Belt and Road Initiative with China at the center. His problem now is that if he goes on trying to be too aggressive, he will end up rubbing up other countries up the wrong way.
Thank you, Keith. Bruce, did you all come off mute and put your video on?
Yeah, thank you. There's my video coming up, I think. Thank you, Keith. It's a pleasure to hear you speak. I always enjoy hearing you speak on 7 Sunrise. Not sure why my video is not coming on. My question relates to China and Taiwan because I'm due to travel there in March, notwithstanding COVID. But yeah, I think you've answered the question anyhow. Do you think I should travel or should I stay away?
Well, my advice is always that you have to follow what the Australian government website, Smart Traveller, has to say. That's the basic issue.
Yes.
I can never say anything which is to the contrary of what you're getting. And as you know, the Australian government has basically said, don't go overseas at all. So that would include China and Taiwan. But you need to always follow smarttraveller.gov. I'm never going to say anything that's contrary to what is shown on that website.
Yeah,
Thank you. Any other questions? Ian, I believe you're next.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Keith, for a wonderful talk. You can hear me okay?
Something
Yeah, okay.
Ken.
Keith, you raised the Bush-Gorbachev agreement, and I think since then Putin possibly has got concerns of NATO, working closely with Poland, and perhaps the fear that the Ukraine had an interest in some of the Western offers of various assistance and partnerships in various ways. I think Putin said in his early days that Russia would never allow the tanks to come rolling through neighbouring countries. They learnt from Napoleon and they learnt from Hitler. So Ukraine is obviously a very sensitive perspective for Putin. I think the other thing, Keith, I'd like you to just comment on as well is the importance to the Russian Navy as the permafrost hit Vladivostok ports and also St. Petersburg ports. The Crimean Peninsula for the Russian Navy is absolutely essential for Putin. And I'm wondering how much of this is basically Putin's fears that the West is getting too close.
Yeah, well, that's certainly you've summed up Putin's point of view, that he is paranoid about an invasion from the West. I don't think NATO is going to invade Russia, but that's obviously embedded in the Russian DNA, and may seem irrational to us, but it's within the Russian DNA. And that the Russians had to take back Crimea because they feared the Ukrainian would be joining NATO, and that NATO would then take Crimea, and that would then choke in Russia in terms of its access to eventually down into the Mediterranean. The permafrost issue I find fascinating at the moment, mainly not so much because of the Western side, but what's happening in the Russian Far East. I actually spent a Christmas there well over 30 years ago in Khabarovsk, where you've got this Russian and Chinese territory on either side of the river. You can actually walk, in theory, across the river in winter from Russia into China. You wouldn't, of course, because you get your head shot off, but you could do that. Now, what is interesting is that the permafrost is now beginning to melt because of climate change. And so suddenly areas which were previously off limit because of the sheer difficulty of digging down through the permafrost, those areas are opening up. And if you look at Russia, most Russians live on the western end. So that's around Moscow. This Russian landmass is still 10 time zones long. So it takes you half a day to fly from one end of Russia to the next. It means if you're in Vladivostok or Khabarovsk and you ring Moscow, they're either just about to go to home or they're just starting for the day. It's a very long country. It's still, even with the loss of the Soviet Empire, still the largest landmass of a country in the world. And the eastern end is largely depopulated. Very few people are living there. And the Russians feel very vulnerable about their rear end. They feel vulnerable about the western side because that's the front door for the Napoleons and the Hitler. But they also feel very vulnerable about their rear end because that's the end through which Attila the Hun, not Attila the Hun, but the Moguls swept through Russia into the Middle East, Genghis Khan. So what we're looking at then is paranoia on the part of the Russians. Their fear is the Chinese will just move over the border and then we'll do the mining on Russian soil, because you'll be able to get access to all the resources that are currently frozen. So that is yet another flashpoint, and it's another headache for Putin. I might also say, on the subject of headaches for Putin, is he's running out of people. Because of the depressing nature of life for the ordinary Russian, they're not bringing children into the world, and they're drinking themselves into an early death. So Russia is actually losing people and will be pretty well empty in about 200 years' time. So Putin has got an immense number of domestic issues. There is also, let me just say, from Biden's point of view, this debate behind closed doors in Washington, D.C., because you've got some people who are saying, forget Russia. That's yesterday's enemy. The Russians are not a problem. The real problem is China. We don't want to be taking on both. Let's work with Russia to oppose China. China is the enemy of the future.
Thank you. I'm just doing a bit of a time checker. Chris, I believe you've got your hand up, so maybe we can do one super quick question, and then let's jump into Sam Horton and our induction. So Chris, take it away.
Thank you. Fantastic insight into the political situation in Great Britain, Keith. Thank you for that. What does it mean economically? I mean, we've had the Brexit. There's still the controversial discussion of the Brexit being beneficial or non-beneficial. Where do you see it currently and in the future?
As to whether or not Brexit is beneficial, it depends on who you talk to and their perspective. You've got some people who, like environmentalists, who are saying it's great because a common agricultural policy was bad for the European environment. Now that Britain will be able to operate on its own and have better environmental regulations. You've got other people who employ foreigners who are saying we need that cheap labor from Poland and elsewhere, and we can't get it now, or they're reluctant to come into this country. The City of London has managed to survive. It's interesting because one of the great fears with Brexit is that you would find some of the finance houses in Germany perhaps coming to prominence, but in fact, the City of London has survived. And of course, you've also got the flashpoint of Northern Ireland. So I don't think you can say one way or the other that Brexit has benefited or not benefited the British. I think it's one issue after another. Don't forget, they were in the European Union for half a century. It's going to take a good many decades to work out whether or not they've benefited from pulling out of the European Union.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Keith, for those insights, and thanks very much, everyone, for those questions. Let's turn our attention now to Tom, if you want to kind of take us away just to close us out tonight and induct Sam.
Yes, thank you so much. It's with a great deal of pleasure that we close this evening out with the induction of a new member, Samuel Horton. Can we switch over to Dave Columbro, because Sam and Dave are together, and I'd like to be able to address Samuel through Dave Columbro's camera. Can we do that, Dave?
Yep, so I've just pinned yourself and David.
Okay. That'd be beautiful.
Yep, so I've done it on my screen. It might be different on your screen.
Okay,
Can everyone see?
What's what?
Can everyone see Sam?
There we
Yes.
go. There we go.
I don't know.
Yes. Yes, I can see. I can see. Good evening, Samuel. How are you?
Good, thanks, Tom.
Oh, good. Listen, I'm going to now start the
They
ceremony.
can only
to induct
announce
you
tomorrow.
Excuse me, Pete. Could you please mute everyone else? Somehow there's an open mic.
Yep, everyone's muted.
Okay. Okay. Good. Now, if we would, could we go back to Dave Columbro and to Sam?
Yep.
Okay.
Great.
Samuel, it's with a great deal of pleasure that we welcome you into our club this evening. I'd like to, if I could, to go through a very short induction ceremony, which is customary and which will help to frame your entry into our club. So let me start by saying, Samuel Horton, You have been chosen for membership in the Rotary Club of King Cross because of your standing in the community and your personal qualities, which we believe will make you an outstanding Rotarian. By joining the Rotary Club of King Cross, you become part of 55 years of service to the cross and a part of a worldwide organization of business and professional leaders united to provide humanitarian service and to encourage high ethical standards. We accept you as a member because we believe you will adopt these high standards of Rotary as your own, as you already have shown, and will fulfill your membership obligations. One important privilege will be your regular enjoyment of the friendship of like-minded individuals, not only in this club, but anywhere Rotarians gather. And let me say parenthetically, there is a huge and active Rotary ecosystem out there that I'm sure you will enjoy interacting with and becoming a part of. Your proposer, Rotarian David Columbro, will now present you with your Rotary pin and your membership kit. And Dave, if you would be kind enough also to pull out the certificate, yes, and your Rotary badge. There we go. That is your official.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
You'll see this back. Oh, thank you.
And let me say that your Rotary pin should be worn at all times. This will identify you as a Rotarian and give you a warm entry into over 46,000 Rotary clubs around the world with 1.4 million Rotarians in over 200 countries. Your name badge identifies you and your vocation as a filmmaker. And I believe, Samuel, that you're the first filmmaker that we've had in the club. So this is terrific, really terrific. Samuel, we expect much from you in the way of fellowship and Rotary service. And we in turn pledge to make your welcome into the club and assist you in growing in Rotary knowledge. It is with a pleasure that I now extend you the right hand of Rotary Fellowship and give you a hearty welcome as a member of the King's Cross Rotary Club. Fellow Rotarians, I present to you our new member, Samuel Horton. Will you please welcome him? And to you, Samuel, on behalf of the club, may I extend our continuing best wishes and support as a now fellow Rotarian. Congratulations, Samuel.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're really, really pleased and glad to have you. If you would like, you may say a very quick word of thanks. I've given you 20 seconds so you don't overdo it.
As I say, thank you, Tom, and to David for this is a real honor for me. And I know there is a family connection for myself going back with Rotary. So I'd love to reconnect with that and to use that to do some real good in the community. And just thank you for allowing me to be a part of this. The honor is mine. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you so much, Samuel. And let me say that hopefully when we get back together, some of our other club members will have a great opportunity to interact with you and get to know you better. So congratulations again, Samuel. Thank you, Dave, for proposing him, and for you, Kenneth, as the membership chairman for bringing this about. Having said that, and welcome Samuel into our club, Pete, can we pull up the four-way test that we can conclude our evening together?
Sure thing. Let me do that now.
And I'm going to ask people if they will mute themselves. And Pete, would you lead us in the four-way test?
Absolutely. Can everybody see my screen okay? If so,
Yes.
let's jump
Yeah.
into it. Is it the truth?
Is it the
Is
truth?
it the truth?
Is it fair to all concerned?
Is it fair?
Is it fair to all? Sir.
Will it build goodwill and better friendships?
Will it build
Build goodwill and better friendships.
Will it be beneficial to all concerned?
Will it be beneficial to all concerned?
To Australia, the Queen, and Rotary. Cheers.
Great.
To Australia, Queen, and Rotary.
Thank you. Thank you, Keith.
Thank
Thank
you so much. Thank you so much, everyone. And Keith, thank you again for this fantastic start off for the second half of the Rotary year. And guests, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We hope that when we have another combined session, we'll have an opportunity to join with you. So it's been a pleasure having you. I hope it's been a great night for everybody. Keith, thanks again. As you said yourself, it's the optics that count, and you delivered tonight in spades. So, thanks again, everyone. And board members, we'll see you next week, and fellow club members in 2 weeks, and we'll be circulating what we'll be doing and who we will have addressing us. So again, be safe, stay safe, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us this evening to hear Keith. Again, good night.
Good night, everyone.
And thank you,
Good
Pete, for hosting.
That's okay. Good night, everyone.
Good night, Irene.